Hi, I'm Spencer Krause. I've been building robots for over 20 years. In that time, I've seen a lot of interesting things, and I've heard a lot of interesting stories. Collaborative with Spencer Krause is a place where my colleagues and I can relax, crack a drink, and talk about some of the crazier things we've seen at work and some of the experiences we've had that have gotten us to where we are today. Subscribe today to join the collaboration. Welcome to the Collaborative Podcast. I'm your host, Spencer Krause. Our guest today is Peter Seiff. Peter is the CEO of Aethon. Peter, welcome to the pod.
Thanks, Spencer. Thanks for inviting me. This is a great studio and a really cool place.
Thanks so much, buddy. Yeah, this is our first recording at the new studio here in Rockwell Park. They are the second major sponsor of the podcast after SK Robotics. Really excited to be here.
Yeah, it's a really big jewel here in the city. I've never been here, but look forward to coming back.
I guess maybe just to go right in, Aethon is kind of like almost an unsung hero in the Pittsburgh robotics community. I mean, you guys are easily the most successful robotics company in the city, but I feel like it's, people talk about the self-driving companies or the humanoid companies first. And I mean, I don't know, what's it been like? You've been involved for almost 20 years now, just kind of slugging along and building up this empire, I don't want to say quietly because, you've been making waves in hospitals.
Well, yeah, we did. We just celebrated our 20th anniversary in November of last year. So we've been around for 20 years. We're very proud of that. I think, defining success comes in a lot of different ways. I think there are a lot of companies that, in this area and in this business that have been successful. I think the way that sometimes I think about it is maybe we're the most interesting. And I say that maybe it's a little bit defensive. I say that because we're not new. And sometimes I think because we're not new, people think we're not interesting. And I actually think that's exactly what makes us interesting is that we're not new, because as we both know, this is a business with a lot of companies that haven't made it that far.
100%.
And so I think the fact that we've been around for 20 years is what makes us as interesting as anything else.
You guys have a viable business model. You have customers that actually want your robots, not because they're robots, but because they're getting things done at their facilities.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. That's the way that we think about it. Somebody taught me this a long time ago. They said people don't wake up in the morning and think they want to buy a robot. Right, so that may be changing, but 20 years ago that was the case. And so we had to figure out how we were going to make a market. And so that's something that we've done, I think, that makes this interesting. Our business has survived because we've been selling robots. And sometimes I say this, sometimes it's controversial, but we've been putting robots to work.
Nice.
Sometimes people don't want to say that, but that's exactly what it means to survive in the robotics business, is to put robots to work. So yeah, we've been around a long time, which means we had to invent a lot of things on our own, right? There was no ROS when we started, right? There were no help desk kits, right? Or out of the box, there was no fleet management systems that you could just go buy.
So you guys rolled your own middleware, you rolled your own fleet management, you rolled your own help desk setup? Wow.
Everything. And that was actually one of the things that we realized that we would need to do to be successful in healthcare, was that we really needed to be vertically integrated. I think back then, and probably even today to a certain extent, robotics has been probably very successful, much more successful in industrial applications than in healthcare. Healthcare needed a different model, right? They needed a complete solution that somebody could provide to them. So, we decided that we would design the robots, we would make the robots, we would sell the robots, we'd install the robots, and we'd maintain the robots. And that was our business model, and we think that's why we were successful in healthcare ultimately.
What was your first big win, going into it? Was there a moment where you're like, this is going to work? This is a real business?
Yeah. Well, I'd say there were probably, there were probably at least two pivotal moments for us, right? One was getting into our first hospital and actually seeing it work and getting great feedback from our customers saying, we can see how this is really going to help deliver better care for our patients. Because that's really what it's about. Again, it's really not about the robot itself or the technology that's inside the robot. It's, does it deliver the results? Literally, right? In our case, does it literally deliver? The other pivotal point for us was when we realized that the market could be so much bigger for us. So when we first entered the market, we kind of came in the side door, I'll say. There was a big class of robots that everybody knows as AGVs, automated guided vehicles. And there were a few installations throughout the United States where they had invested enough money, not only in the vehicles, but for the space, right, and the infrastructure that was required. Our market was a little bit different in the beginning. Our market was about putting robots to do work that was a lot smaller than what AGVs did. And so, our theory was there were a lot of buildings that were already standing and existing, and they all needed robots. And not every hospital could be rebuilt to accommodate the AGVs. So we targeted a market which in theory was really big by going after something that was really small, if that makes sense. And so we were very successful at that. We put in a lot of robots that did pharmacy and lab type of deliveries, which tended to have smaller payloads. But the secret sauce that we had at Aethon was that we had figured out how to get robots to run in very public and unstructured spaces, right? These were hospitals where they didn't have back hallways or depots or dedicated elevators to use our robots. So we had to make them work in front of everybody. It was a lot of pressure. But when we figured out that we could do that and people accepted it, what started to happen is that the hospitals that wanted the bigger systems were coming to us and they said, hey, we want that too. We know there's AGVs out there, but we don't want to put in the dedicated infrastructure. That costs a lot of money, right? Hospitals.
Those were the wires you had to bury.
There were the wires, there were beacons, there were magnets in the floor. There were all sorts of, accommodating infrastructure.
Yeah, fair enough.
Back in the day.
Outdated infrastructure these days.
Exactly. It all costs money. And still these vehicles, the AGVs, were very large and people were unwilling to have them operate around people. So you needed separate hallways or separate rooms where they would enter and exit. And our model was, again, originally to carry smaller stuff, but people looked at that and said, could we do that for everything? We don't want to build all this extra infrastructure. We don't want our hospital workers to have to go to these depot rooms to access the goods that the robots are delivering. It sort of half defeats the purpose, right? So we actually had this model where we could deliver to where the work was being done. And so we went from having a fairly, a market where people were looking at delivering small goods to market where they wanted to use the same model to deliver everything in the hospital. And so we started winning the projects that the AGVs had traditionally won before, when originally we thought that we were going to let them have that market to themselves. And we ended up having both markets. And that's
awesome.
When we knew that we really were onto something.
Nice. What was the first hospital you guys were in?
The first hospital here was St. Margaret's, UPMC St. Margaret's over in Aspinwall.
Nice.
Yeah. And UPMC's been a great customer ever since. We're in several of those facilities. I think you and I went to visit some of the robots over there.
Yeah, for sure.
So, and then, we had a lot of great early customers. A lot of them tended to be the bigger university style hospitals, tended to be, into the technology and exploring what was new. And again, probably early adopters is the word I would use. But obviously after that, it caught on. We have hospitals of all shapes and sizes now. Sometimes people think it's only for big hospitals, but we have hospitals that are under 100 beds that use our robots.
How many robots do you typically run in a hospital that size?
Well, it's a good question. When we originally got into the business, it was probably fairly standard for us to have 2, 3, 4, 5 robots in a hospital. And some of the number of robots that we would have in a hospital didn't always necessarily correlate with the size of the hospital. It depended on the workflow model they were using.
Oh, that's interesting. I wouldn't have thought that.
Yeah. So, for instance, I'll give you an example. You could have a big hospital that has a lot of beds. But they do bulk food delivery, meaning that all the meals go out at the same time. Everybody eats the same food, right? That's a model that a lot of hospitals use. Just send them all out. And you might be able to do that with, a smaller number of robots. Most of the hospitals that we've actually installed robots in use something called a room service model, which means that they're delivering meals all day long. And nice. These can be, patients can call down and order a meal anytime they want and within a limited menu, right? And based on doctors and prescriptions, they can order some of anything they want, which means we're making deliveries all day. So sometimes a smaller hospital that has that model might need more robots than a bigger hospital that delivers everything at once.
That makes a lot of sense because it's a la carte. You can't really bulk your orders and deliver a whole bunch of things and then have people take the last mile.
That's right. So it really can be a little bit deceiving. Small hospitals can have a fair number of robots. Again, another good example is that when we go into pharmacies, a lot of pharmacies, in fact, most pharmacies have tube systems, right? And they'll deliver a lot of their medications through tube systems, but not
Well, like a bank uses?
Yeah,
I
exactly.
didn't realize they used those.
Yeah, no, absolutely. They're very popular in pharmacy, and and they're a good technology for a lot of the deliveries. There's still a segment of medications that are not suited well for that delivery. Either they're too large to fit in the tube, or they can't undergo the shaking or the jostling that happens inside the tube system. So those will go in the robot. But some hospitals, especially smaller hospitals, sometimes don't have a tube system. So a lot of that volume would go through the robot. So some of the smaller hospitals might have a higher percentage of their volume that goes through our robot than a larger hospital might have.
Well, they have the tube infrastructure, so they wouldn't need the robots in the same way.
Exactly. So the amount of volume we see in a robot really can vary. Sometimes it's driven by the size of the hospital. Sometimes it's driven by the workflow. Sometimes it's driven by the other technology that they have installed.
Awesome.
Yeah,
that's really cool. So how did you get into robotics? Like, when was it that you knew you wanted to, go into this field that a lot of us find ourselves in?
I don't think I just made the decision. I think it just happened.
Just found you.
But to be honest, I think that's what happened.
I think that's why you're doing well with it.
Yeah, I am a little unusual. I'm not an electrical engineer. I'm not a mechanical engineer. I kind of came into it sideways, to be honest. I started my career at an IT consulting firm in DC. And part of what I was working on is the development of the original electronic medical record systems, which were really not the electronic medical records that we think of today. They were literally scanned papers. So they were document imaging systems. And so, I helped to create some of the original products around those. And part of the delivery of that product was being able to store this massive amount of data, right? We didn't have the hard drives that we do today. So we stored all of that on optical disks. I know this seems like a detour, but
no, it's interesting to me.
In order to store all of these records, we stored them on these optical disks, and they were stored in what was called jukeboxes in those days, which is exactly what you'd think it was. It's when you needed a certain record, it knew which platter it was on, and that platter was put on the reader automatically by what we would today maybe call a robot.
The golden age of automation.
That's exactly right. So that was kind of my first entry into it, was really trying to retrieve data off of an optical platter. And I was doing that for a while, and then, to be honest, my wife was from Pittsburgh. She wanted to move back to Pittsburgh, and I said, well, that's great. I'm not sure that I want to. I'd like to move back to New Jersey. That's where I'm from. And she said, well, if I can find you a good job, would you consider moving to Pittsburgh? And I said, sure, but you're going to have to do it. I said, I'm not interested in looking. And one day she paged me, because we had pagers back in those days, and she paged me. I was actually in New York City. I can remember this. And I called her back from a payphone, and she said, hey, you have an interview in an hour. I said, really? She goes, yeah. You said, that I was in charge of doing this, and I sent out your resume, and there's a great company in Pittsburgh called Automated Healthcare, and they love your healthcare experience, and they're developing a robot to dispense pharmacy medications in hospitals. And I said, wow, that sounds really interesting. And so anyway, to be honest, that was probably really how I got into robotics. It was my transition from DC to Pittsburgh. I found a really great job at a really great young company with great people. And I never looked back since. I've been doing, I'll say, true healthcare robotics. If I call that the real start, that was since, I think, 1994.
Beautiful.
So I've been doing it ever since.
Tupac was still alive when you started on this.
That's right. That's right.
Wild. Yeah, no, I remember one of the first robots I had experience with was also handling CDs. It was my one friend's dad was kind of a mentor to me growing up. I was a child in the 90s. It was probably around the same time. It was like 94 to 97 area. And he had this guy who he owned a recording studio, and he had this guy who would take CDs out of a CD burner, put them in a stack, and then put them in a printer, and then put them in a finish pile. Mm-hmm. And he was in his attic trying to figure out how to automate that guy's job. And he's like, sitting there with like solenoids on arms, and he figured out a machine that was able to move the CDs, from one pile to another via the printer. And that was the first robot I ever saw or touched or, got to work on. And,
yeah, no, that's pretty much exactly what these jukeboxes did. They were not the smartest devices in the world, but that's what they did. And I'm trying to remember. I'm sure I'll be wrong, but I'll record it here for for history. Is that I think each platter held 7 gigabytes
per platter, like
yes,
all of them
per platter, and that was considered immense back then.
That must have been like 100 discs. I mean, I don't know. Maybe it was. I'm probably getting that wrong actually myself.
Yeah, no. Each platter, and I'm trying to remember how many platters were inside the jukebox. To be honest, I can't remember that. Yeah. But yeah, I think it was 7 gigabytes per platter. And that was considered, again, immense. And you had to be very, very intentional about where you recorded it because like CDs, they weren't erasable. So once you recorded it, that was it. That's where it was going to stay, and that's where the patient record was. And so, when that patient would come back in for a follow-up visit or something, we actually created algorithms to prefetch all of the data from the optical platters onto hard drives.
That's pretty cool.
The night before.
Yeah, you knew which patients were coming. You'd get ready, and then when somebody no-showed, you wasted effort.
That's right. In some percentage of cases, you could prefetch accurately. In some cases, obviously, ER visits or whatever, it wouldn't be the same, but it'd still be accessible. It would just take longer.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But yeah, that's exactly how the machine worked. It was just an arm that took platters, put them on the reader, and took them off a reader as the data was needed.
That's so cool. And I'm just picturing the old Wurlitzer juke boxes, with the arm that did that. And I'm sure it was based off that.
Not only it was kind of like that was bigger, but it actually, if you remember the mini computers, the IBM System 36, that was actually the driver for the jukebox.
That's the one that's like a quarter rack, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking over at your kind of, it's probably that size over there.
The size of the bar.
Yeah, the size of the bar, just for the driver that made the jukebox work.
That's cool.
Yeah, so it ended up taking up a fairly massive amount of space, over time as you stored all these records that way.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, I imagine like in those days, that was probably the tail end of, like the System 36 and that size of computer.
Exactly. That's, I think, why they used them. I think they probably were getting some good deals on them. So they said, we'll just convert these into drivers for the jukeboxes. But yeah, that's how it worked.
Hospitals will buy them.
Yeah. That's what they did.
Nice. No, that's awesome. I mean, it's just wild, the fact that, like you had 7 gigs to a platter and that was immense. And, now it's like you can buy a 24 terabyte hard drive. And so.
Oh, easy. Yeah. Yeah, you probably could fit, everything that was in the data room on one hard drive.
Oh, I'm sure of it.
And it's probably much faster.
Yeah.
Probably much faster. So, but of course, it takes all the art and technique away of having to be very careful about where you store it, right? When you write it to the disk, what you decide is going to go on one disk, right? Because that was a separate procedure. It wasn't written immediately as it was scanned, right? You would store it somewhere, and then you'd make a decision about, okay, when are we going to commit this to a disk? Because you wanted certain information to be together on the same disk.
And there was money that went into that decision, because I'm sure the disks were more expensive then than they are now.
Sure.
I mean, if you can find one now.
Sure. And as you were prefetching patient records, you wanted to make sure that you could have as few platter swaps as possible.
Right? For sure. And you probably want to consolidate into as few disks as possible so you can fit more things on a platter.
That's right. So anyway, it was a fun project way back then. That was probably in like 1990, 91. We were working on that system. And I've actually been back to the hospital that originally installed it. And you would think that paper records were gone. I'm sure that
you would hope by now.
Medical professionals that are on here, there's still a lot of paper in hospitals.
Yeah, that was the other job I did when I was in the 90s was I would do the medical, like I would organize my dad's charts in his medical office. And I mean, they were just paper folders with letters on them. And we would send past due notices to people. That was another job. Mm-hmm. We got paid in syringes with no needles on them that we'd use as squirt guns, chase each other around the office. There was a shower in there.
That's a pretty good deal for somebody.
Oh, it was a great deal for the office. Not so much for us illegals working in there.
Yeah,
it's underage.
In addition to the System 36 and the jukebox, it just reminded me there was the scanners that we used. I think they were also IBM. I can't remember now, but they were converted from scanners that were used to scan checks at banks. So they scan very, very high speed. But obviously we were scanning documents, and it was it was a kind of it's a mass process. Right? There's thousands, millions of pages. I don't know. There's lots and lots of pages of medical records. And, as a patient would get discharged, they'd get these records, and they'd be this thick, and somebody's responsible for scanning these in. And, in the early days, especially this was the early days maybe of high-tech IT. I don't know if everybody would agree that was high-tech IT. But also I was a fairly young associate at this firm. I had to take help desk duty, especially on holidays. And so we would get pages when we needed to intervene and help the customer with something. And there was this time I got a call, and they said, I don't know what's going on. The foot pedal isn't working. And I said, I'm not sure what you mean, the foot pedal. Now, there was a thing that you could use to operate the scanner.
Oh, that like a sewing machine.
Yeah, kind of like the sewing machine. But that wasn't what they were talking about. I kept asking them about it, and they said, no. The other foot pedal isn't working. And I couldn't figure it out. I said, I don't know what they're talking about. I don't think I'm going to be able to help this. And, it's Thanksgiving, and I want to get back to the turkey. I finally figured out they were talking about the mouse.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
That's hilarious.
They had put the foot pedal. I'm sorry, now I'm confusing it. They had put the mouse on the floor thinking that was the foot pedal they were supposed to use to operate the scanner.
That's hilarious.
So, needless to say, that was in the early days of using
mice, and nobody knew what it was.
Computer. Yeah. So, lots of fun. We've come a long way.
That's hilarious. There's always the one I used to hear about in those days of like, the cup holder in my computer's broken. It's type with a CD-ROM.
Mm-hmm. But no, that's a true story.
That's wild.
I was the person that took that call that day.
That's insane.
So, yeah, I'm sure there's lots of other stories like that. I've seen a lot of things. I sometimes think that we've seen a lot of changes, and since I've been out of school. I'm just when I graduated, we didn't have cell phones, right? I mean, it doesn't seem like I'm that old, but really, just we didn't have a lot of that technology. Just it seems like it was yesterday.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I can still remember when cell phones weren't a thing either, right? I mean, it was the 90s. Nobody had a cell phone. You had a rotary or a touch tone.
Yeah.
And you better be home if somebody's trying to get a hold of you.
We didn't have laptops when I first started out of college. I mean, we had a Compaq made a thing that was like, you mentioned sewing machines before. It looked like a sewing machine case.
That was the big one where you folded out the front, and then that was your keyboard, and they had that CRT monitor.
Yeah, and it was about that big. Yeah, yep. Exactly. And then it had like 2 floppy drives that you could put something in. And for certain projects, when we would travel around the country, we'd take that with us. But boy, it was just crazy. It was so big.
Well, I'm
so
sure
heavy.
It was expensive as heck too. I can only imagine, in those days, that must have been a really bling thing to have.
Yeah. No, you felt a little bit like you were cool carrying it around. Looking back on it now, you're like, boy, that was pretty stupid. I probably should have just waited to get home and done all that work.
But you're like a stockbroker with a car phone. You get the latest tech. You're important.
That's right. Yeah, no, that's we've come a long way. We didn't have email, and all of that is just been since I graduated from college.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, I do kind of miss those days in a lot of ways. I mean,
I was going to say the same thing.
Yeah, the fact that you could go to Radio Shack and solder something up that would actually interact with the real world with a phone line with any number of things.
Yeah.
I mean, you could find schematics, in magazines. You wouldn't necessarily find them on the internet. Like I remember reading 2600, the Hacker Quarterly, and it was like a half-sized magazine that would just have all these different, hacking things you could try, in day-to-day life, and we couldn't wait to try all the things.
Yeah. Well, I was going to say that actually what maybe would have been better if we never had email. There's a lot of email. There's so much email now. It's hard to keep up with all of it.
Yeah, I mean, I do wonder though, like if we didn't have email, what the volume of paper mail would look like. Because I don't like paper mail. Like, I mean, I don't really like email, but I detest paper mail.
That's true. It's a good point.
Yeah.
It's a good point. I think all that's left, at least at my house, is junk mail. So it's pretty easy to do the clean out these days. Pretty much.
I do love putting it in the shredder without reading it.
Yeah. I was just about to say, it usually goes from the mailbox to the shredder. There's not really much to look at anymore.
Yeah. No, I had about a dozen envelopes from a certain bank. I probably shouldn't say which one, but I texted my business banker on the phone. I'm like, okay to shred these? And he's like, yep, go for it.
Yeah.
So I threw them all in the shredder.
That's right. Yeah, there's
we really should turn on paperless.
Yeah, they do give you the option if you want it.
Yeah, I do want it. I just hadn't figured out how to do it until then.
I know.
But after shredding like a dozen unopened letters, that's when I turned it on.
Mm-hmm. I don't miss, I will say, I like having a cell phone. I don't miss having to stop at payphones. That was a thing that we used to do a lot in the old days before. If we were out on the road, our managers would want us to check in at some point. So we'd have to stop at a payphone, sometimes on the side of the road or in the lobby of a hospital or at the airport, and you'd end up, I don't know if you remember, if you had to dial into voicemail, you had to dial about 30 or 40 numbers. Because you had to dial like some long distance code and then a credit card code and then this code, and then inevitably you'd make a mistake on the 29th number and have to start over again.
I had this thing that looked like a wallet in those days that you could put like a speaker up to the microphone on the phone and push a button and it would just macro a lot of that stuff. Yeah.
Eventually I had one of those too, and you just pre-program it so you could do that. But yeah, that's you still had to stop at the payphone.
Was it ever anything important that you got paged for like that? Or was it like a lot of the time like, hey, how you doing? Did you know that Collaborative with Spencer Krause now has a merch store? Please go to cwskmerch.com for the latest in CWSK styles. You can get a hoodie, like the one I'm wearing, t-shirts, hell, we even have whiskey glasses. Everything in the store has custom art that our team worked really, really hard on. So go ahead and show your support for them, me, and the rest of the CWSK team by going to cwskmerch.com today. Better yet, support yourself and use discount code podcast10, all one word, all uppercase, for 10% off your entire order. Thanks for your support and enjoy the rest of the show. With Spencer Krause is sponsored by SKA Robotics. If you're in the market for elite field robotics expertise, please consider hiring SKA Robotics. They sponsor this podcast and solve some of the toughest engineering problems in the world. SKA Robotics can be found at skarobotics.com. Well, it's kind of funny when you see something from a while ago that's totally obsolete, but it's like what you needed to do the thing. Like looking at like the Apollo, rockets that they used to get to the moon. It's like there's so many extra steps there, and like giant computers the size of a room and stuff that, you'd never see now. But there's no way we would have gotten to the moon without, all those extra, because that's what you needed with those days technology. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, good examples. When we came out with our first robot, we didn't even have a LiDAR. They were just too expensive.
That makes sense.
And it forced us to do a lot of other things to make the robot navigate well, right? With I guess what we might consider, less capable sensors.
What were you using?
We were using sonar and infrared.
Nice.
That was it.
Like the sharp 1D infrareds.
Yep.
Yeah, those things are cool.
Yeah, they did the job. Definitely there were some hold your breath moments when we watched some things. But it made you learn a lot about good and bad robot behavior, right? Like what is acceptable behavior when you're operating around people. And I think we internalized a lot of that because we didn't have a shortcut. And then when LiDAR became, affordable, we were able to integrate it, and I think we were much better for it. If we had started with it, I don't know, maybe it would have covered up some of the things, right? And so it forced us to work really hard to get into this area that I think is a specialty for us is robot behavior, and again, how do people and robots interact together in a space, almost to the point where our goal is that people don't even notice them.
Awesome.
Right? So I think when you opened up, you said maybe we're some of the lesser known. In some ways, maybe in some ways we regret that, but in some ways that's our goal, right? We actually want our robots to just blend in.
Well, I mean, like I said before, I love that it's not like a robot for a robot's sake. Like, it's an appliance effectively that's doing a job, right. And that job is delivering things from A to B.
Yeah. No, an interesting topic is what does the robot look like, right? And a lot of, we try to make it blend in, but we've had lots of good feedback on it should look friendly, or it should look like this, or, should have eyes, right? And we've pushed back on that at some level, because we think it is an appliance, right? And that's not what we're trying to do. We have and sometimes I'll say it this way: we have a tool, not a toy, right?
Yeah.
And it's meant to do a job, and it's meant to blend in, and we want it to look like a hospital cart, which,
But I mean, you guys have a sleek brand language. Like, I really like the way that the Aethon robots look, because, they're, like you said, I mean, it just looks like it's there to do a job. It's not a toy. And, it's like something you would trust to get the stuff there.
Yeah, and that's what we want people to treat it like it's a tool, right? And we also want it to be part of the workforce. But again, blending in, we think, helps make everything work smoothly when you've got hundreds of people traveling. I don't know if I think when we were together, you saw, we go over at UPMC, there's the two sky bridges that we travel over. Very public.
The Presby Montefiore bridges.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. One goes over McKee Street. I can't remember the other street, but it goes through that, I think it's the Biomedical Science Building. And there's just a lot of traffic, right? And we can't control it, right? You can't train people. You can't say stay away from the robot, or stay on this side of the hallway, or don't cross that line, because
nobody's going to pay attention to that.
They wouldn't pay attention to it, and they weren't available for the training anyway. I mean, they come in off the street, right? I mean,
they'll probably resent you for telling them what to do.
That's right. There's different people every day, so you don't really have an opportunity to teach them or train them anyway. It just has to be natural, and that's where these behaviors come in, and we just want it to blend in. And I think it does. I think it does. So that's kind of the goal, is to not be noticed in some ways.
I love it. Like, incognito. What is your guys? I mean, can I ask what your guys' market share looks like?
Sure. I mean, we've got in the hospital world, I'll say it this way, because I actually did this myself. We were doing a presentation for an internal thing, and I said, it's not a market that gets followed by analysts, right? The EMR market for hospitals. And I was like, all right, I'm trying to put something together, but I want a third party source. I mean, I think we dominate, right?
Yeah, of course.
And that's what I'm supposed to say. I think we have a large market share now. Again, I would probably caveat that by saying we have a very large share of hospitals that are making decisions about buying robots. We have a very small share, and so does everybody else, of the overall hospital market, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Right. Again, not enough people are waking up thinking they want to buy robots yet. So it's still in the very early stages. But I decided I was going to test out AI. And I don't know if it's a test for AI or not, but I decided to try Perplexity. Have you heard about Perplexity?
Yeah.
I think I heard about it in an ad. I'm not even sure, but I've heard enough about ChatGPT and Copilot and the others. So I said, I'm going to try Perplexity for this. So I typed in, some variety of who has the biggest, market share in hospital AMRs, and it said Aethon dominates this market share. So Perplexity is my favorite AI tool, of course, at the moment. I will say I'm not sure how accurate it is. Of course, it does. It's consistent with what we think. But I will say I'm not sure how accurate it is, because it listed us, and it had, I don't know, it gave me a little pie chart. Maybe we had 85% of the market if I looked at it properly. And then there were three other vendors that made up the other 20%. I never heard of them. So so either I'm not really good at what I do because I don't even know who our competitors are, or Perplexity doesn't quite know what market we're in. So
yeah,
I'm not sure which
it
is.
Did you Google the other ones just to see who they were?
I did. Actually, I was maybe exaggerating. I knew one of them, but they're really more in the hotel market.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The other two I did Google, and they don't compete with us in the hospital market. So
nice.
I don't know where it pulled that information from. So of course, I think anybody who's listening to this podcast knows you can't trust all the answers you see.
No, of course not.
I did like the initial response of us dominating the market, but
that's lovely.
The rest of it, you got to look at it and go, okay, you got to know where it's coming from. But I think we're involved. I go into a lot of hospitals. We do have a lot of market share in this particular segment of the market, which is the logistics delivery inside hospitals. I think one of the things that makes us unique is, originally what made us unique was that we were an AMR and not an AGV. All right. And maybe 10, 15 years ago, that was a significant difference. That's become more commonplace. We see a lot of AMRs.
Yeah, I think it's kind of par for the course to be an AMR now.
But what we don't see is we don't see a lot of AMR vendors who have a portfolio or a lineup that can do big deliveries of the whole cart and also small secure deliveries.
Nice.
And so we obviously have both, and that of course raises lots of interesting topics. I mean, can you mix and match robots, right? I mean, in the healthcare market, people like to buy from one vendor, particularly if in a particular niche, right? They don't want to buy a robot from you and a robot from you and a robot from you and make them all work together. So by providing a portfolio that allows us to transport anything they want to transport, whether it needs to be secured or whether it's big, I think that's a big advantage for us. We see companies out there that have the big or they have the small, but they don't have both.
And their fleets probably don't play well together.
Well, and that's exactly it. That's I think the next interesting topic for robotics is interoperability,
sure.
Right? And then I've delved into this a lot myself recently. I think these words get thrown around a lot. I'm not sure that anybody really knows what they mean, so I'm not going to be able to shed too much light on this for your listeners here. But people talk about hybrid approaches, interoperability, orchestration, fleet management, traffic control, and sometimes I'm not sure that people are discriminating amongst the terms. I think they just think they're all synonyms.
It's the catch-all.
And some people like me are trying to make sure that I think they all mean different things. But I think the truth is, there's robotics hasn't gotten to that point yet. In fact, everybody talks about there becoming standards so that people can have multiple robots of different vendor types in the same building. But if you even look at that market, there's a lot of different standards that are available, which means there isn't a standard, right?
Yeah, makes sense.
And what I always try to claim is that we're the standard, and people say, well, but you're not a standard, you're not open source. And I said, I know, but all the customers use ours. So that makes us the standard, right? So I think it's a standard by fiat, right? By volume, right? Is that we
Windows isn't open source, but it's still on like the vast majority of computers people use for work.
That's exactly right. So, there's lots of different ways to define it, just like there's a lot of different ways to define success. But, that's obviously one of those areas in robotics that's going to be, rapidly changing, is how do you get multiple robots on similar or the same platform so you can take advantage of infrastructure, maps, right, things like that. And it's a good topic. I just don't think it's as easy as some people want it to be.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, especially if you've got different systems that were architected different ways, but not with that interoperability goal in mind, right? So, I mean, I think it's
that's right.
Like you said, easier said than done.
Right. I mean, I'll give you I think it's an easy example. I'm sure that there's people out there that are smarter than me and can figure out, okay, how do you make this work? But a lot of the robots that we see out there use cameras today, right, for navigation and localization. We don't. So how are we going to use our map? Right. So that's that's a difference, and it's a difference that we like. There's reasons that we do that, and there's reasons that we'll consider changing that as well. But for now, that's how our maps are done, which makes it hard for somebody else to use our maps and vice versa.
Yeah. Well, I know you've already told me this, in our conversations, but just for people listening, why not use cameras?
Well, I think in the environments that we're in, cameras have implications beyond the technology, right? So people like to use cameras because I think they're either inexpensive right now or becoming very inexpensive very quickly, and there's lots of choices, right? And there's no doubt that that's true. And I think the technology around cameras and integrating them into things like ROS is really good. The problem is that if you use cameras for those types of functions, it means those cameras are on and you're in an environment where privacy is at a premium.
Right. Either it's a hotel or a hospital, either way, nobody wants to be looked at.
And there's obviously lots of techniques and technology that can be used to help tamp that down. But you still have to deal with the customer who may or may not understand how that works. Right. And I think that's a big hurdle to overcome. And so if you can have a robot that doesn't need it, I think it can be an advantage in some environments, right? In environments where the privacy isn't needed, the navigational advantages may be worth going with the camera.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
But for us, that's the the decision that we've made for now.
So it's almost branding to some extent of, hey, there's no way this would ever get a picture of you because it doesn't have cameras on.
That's right. That's right. I mean, and again, we're exclusive in healthcare, right? So for us, it makes sense, right? We've built a product for that market, and those are the specifications or the requirements that market has. So, we want it to be accepted in that market, right? That kind of going back to what we said, part of the reason we've been in business is because we created a market for this. And part of that is listening and understanding what they want, and not just buying a robot for robot's sake, right? Which is, we can all put all the sensors on it that we want. We could put cameras on it too, right? We can get the ROS drivers to do that, but there are reasons why you wouldn't. And so we designed ours differently.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. What are are there other markets that you're interested in, I guess, besides like delivering, or, I mean, I'm assuming you have your hands full with that, but just some of the things that robots are going into, like what are you seeing these days that seems interesting to you?
It's there's so many things. I mean, there's other markets, there's other robots. I think for us, our focus is on healthcare. Obviously I described my background. I've been doing healthcare for a long time. A lot of the folks that we have at Aethon came from automated healthcare. We've all been doing healthcare a long time. I think part of our success, as you said it best earlier, is not about the robot. It's about understanding that customer and the workflows that customer has. I think there's a lot of other robots that are interesting for the healthcare environment, right? And maybe it's foreshadowing. It's how do we make them work together? Right, we're not going to I assume we'll not make all the robots that could possibly be used in a hospital. I mean, we already don't, right? We don't make surgical robots, right? But those have been fairly successful, I'd say. And there's a lot more types of robots that have been popular in hospitals. We don't make those. But I think looking at opportunities to introduce more of that type of automation in hospitals is what we're going to focus on.
That makes a lot of sense. So partnering with other companies that are making different types of appliances and robots in hospitals.
Exactly. And looking at, how do we share things that we've already talked about, like the maps. There's a lot of people, this one's hard too, is how do you share charging stations, right? At some point.
That is hard. That requires almost a standardization at the very front end of the design process.
Exactly. So it's a very difficult thing to do, especially retroactively. It's almost like everybody has to design together up front. But one of the things that we know about hospitals, because we work in hospitals, is that they're very limited on space. So where do you put all the chargers? Right, so it's something that we will come back to over and over again as hospitals have more and more robots. Right, we think we put a lot of robots into hospitals, and we already have trouble finding space for everything. And based on our conversations we have with lots of people, I think we want to put even more robots in hospitals. Maybe not the ones that are from Aethon today, whether they're floor cleaning robots, whether they're humanoid robots, right? But they all need to charge somewhere.
Well, I mean, if you could charge a wheelchair or something else like on the same charger as an Aethon robot, I mean, there's value in that.
That's right. So those are just real practical, almost mundane things that a lot of people don't think about. But that's something that we spend a lot of time on at Aethon, is helping the hospitals design the space where the robots are going to go and the chargers are going to go, and the workflow and the routes that they're going to use. Because again, all those things are very important to making the project successful. It's not just building the robot, with the best technology and and the best software, and then sending it off into the world. If that world isn't ready for it,
or doesn't want it in the first place,
it's not going to work.
Yeah.
And some of it is just understanding how you're going to use it, particularly in quantities, right? So. Again, I think one of the things that has helped to make us, I'll say successful, but maybe well known, stand out a little bit, at least in the hospital circles, is that a lot of our implementations are pretty large. I mean, you asked me earlier about the numbers, and I think we started on the answer, and then we got on to a detour, which is the fun part about the conversation. But we were talking about smaller numbers in the beginning. Most of our customers today, because we had that pivotal moment that I mentioned, are buying 20, 30, 40, 50 robots. We have one site that has 90 robots right now. That's a whole different animal, right? That's finding space for 90 robots. or I'll use the word orchestrating 90 robots because it really is orchestration.
That's when you need the robot room.
That's right. You need to understand where they're going to be all the time and make sure that they don't create their own traffic jams, right? Because otherwise you're defeating the purpose of having them. And so if they're all trying to get on the elevator at once, that's not a good plan. And that can certainly happen if you don't design all of the software that runs it in the background. So those are the things that we've worked on a lot over the years. We obviously didn't start there. We started with one robot, probably went to 2, 5, and then when you start hitting these big numbers, there's a whole other level of difficulty that comes into it, because you end up with a lot of constraints, right? Especially, even today we try to have as little special infrastructure as required to support even a 50 robot site, a 90 robot site. We don't want them to have to design the hospital really any differently. We may want to tell them, here, I would do this, I'd add an extra door here. We may want to have one-way traffic here, but these are things that we would do on the maps as opposed to in the architecture. But without doing those things, it might not work. But what you need to do is, again, you have to think about all the constraints, right? So you may have some hallways that are narrower than others. I can tell you this, you'll never get as many elevators as you'd like to get. So you're always going to have a constraint there, right? So you're going to limit your throughput at some level. So you have to figure out how you're going to manage that. And again, we've designed software and some ancillary systems to help hospitals deal with what can be a lot of traffic.
Are you seeing a return to like the dedicated robot elevators with those size deployments, or is it still like just cohabitating with people?
It depends. I would say not dedicated just for robots. We would see in a larger installation, we might have elevators that are dedicated certain times of day. Meal times are pretty critical for us. Even if you have a room service environment like I was describing before, people still want to eat around lunchtime.
Yeah,
they still want to eat around
Gaussian.
dinner time. Right. So everybody's, the biorhythms kick in, and everybody's ordering food at the same time, and they're trying to get it out. Most hospitals actually have KPIs around food delivery. And of course, you want the hot food to be hot and the cold food to be cold. Otherwise, you get complaints. And believe it or not, in the healthcare world, feedback on the food is probably as important as feedback on the clinical aspect of the stay, because most of us, and you're in a little bit of a different group because you have physicians in your family, but a lot of people who go to hospital don't know what to expect. Right, and they don't know if they're actually getting, what kind of stretcher am I on, or do they use the right kind of scalpel? Like when I was in surgery, they have no idea, but they know if they like the food or not. So they'll tend to actually overweight that when they grade the hospital.
Oh, that's interesting.
And every hospital, they do have these surveys that are used, and actually helps determine the reimbursement that the hospitals get from insurance companies, particularly the government-based insurance companies. So these ratings are really important. So anyway,
I didn't realize the reimbursement was tied to the ratings. That's wild.
Yeah. So if you skew out, I'm not an expert on this, but if you skew high, you can get extra reimbursement, and if you skew too low, you can actually lose reimbursement from the standard based on the results of those surveys. And what they've done is over, however many years, they've realized that the food quality tends to have an overweighted effect on the survey, because that's what people know and understand.
So if you can install robots or any kind of means of getting food faster and fresher and more accurately to the right patients at the right time, then your reimbursements are going to be better.
That's
the hospital administrators are going to be happier. I mean, and
that's
everybody looks good.
It's a cheat code, right? It is. It's probably the least expensive way to boost your ratings, right?
That's incredible.
You
could buy a Da Vinci robot that nobody notices. It's there on the tour.
That's right. No, it has probably other benefits, right? Maybe you can do the surgery in half the time, and maybe because of a smaller incision, it heals faster, right? There's things like that.
But nobody's going to notice.
Right. But true. It's probably more of a revenue play on how many surgeries you can do per hour. But yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon, and that's why a lot of the hospitals we see have moved to this type of meal plan, which is this room service. But anyway, it puts a lot of pressure on us, right? Because people are measuring the time it takes from the time the order is received to the time it gets into the robot to the time the robot gets to the room.
That's the KPI you were referring to.
Right. And so typically hospitals will have like a 45-minute turnaround time from the time the order is received. And so what typically happens...
So more than that's considered bad, less is considered good, effectively.
That's right. And they want to beat it, right? And of course, what typically happens is the order comes in, and then they take 20 minutes to prepare it, 20 minutes to load it, and then we get 5 minutes to prepare it. And we always say the allocation isn't fair. We should get like 12 or 15 minutes, right? But in any case, what tends to happen because of the curve that you were referring to, a lot of the meals go out probably in a 1 hour
that makes
stretch,
sense.
which means you're sending out hundreds of meals, one after the other after the other, and they all have to get sent by a robot on the elevator up to the room. We have to turn the robots back around so that they can
one
take
robot, one meal, or is it?
No, it's typically not, but it's usually the average in a room service is only like 7.
Okay, 7 meals per robot.
7 meals per robot is about the average when we track it, even though the carts themselves can usually hold about 20. Because if you waited longer than it took to get the 7th one in,
you get the cold food.
You get the cold
your
food.
KPI starts going to crap.
Exactly. So what happens is you just get this huge peak at each mealtime. So it takes a lot of robots in order to meet the time frame, but then you can have a throughput constraint at the elevator, right? So we have to manage that really well.
How do you keep people off the elevator when you really need it?
So the hospital can help. Sometimes they're something as easy as a sign. Sometimes it's just people can be locked out. Now this has to happen through training, right? Which is if you get on the elevator, some of the elevator companies we deal with, if you get on the elevator during a lockout time, when you press the button, it won't light up. So only the robot can send a wireless signal to light up a floor, and you press a button and nothing happens. A lot of hospitals don't like to do that, and we don't love to do it always either, because if you're not super familiar with that going on, it can be a little scary.
Yeah, you might be freaking out. Like, what's going on?
Why can't I press a button and the doors are closing and you're inside with a robot? And so typically what we do is we actually, and again, this kind of goes back to some of the earlier conversation we had. In the early days, in order to get our robots to work in these buildings, we had to develop our own elevator controller. So we actually make our own elevator controllers.
Nice.
And they are connected to the manufacturer's elevator controller. And through that, we can control how the elevator operates. So we can actually make sure it comes to us empty. So I won't go into the details here, but it's proprietary. But we actually can make sure it gets empty. And then through robot behaviors, and again, back to that behaviors thing, we know how to behave just based on, millions and millions of observations and cycles, how to get on the robot and sort of discourage people from getting on with us. And 99.9% of the time it works that way.
And sometimes you get a very angry, confused person following a robot into the elevator.
Yeah, well, you know what? Actually, what happens is you get a person who wants an express ride. So typically,
So people know.
Some people know. So once you've worked at the hospital enough, you can typically identify certain robots, which floors they might be going to, particularly if they're going down. So if you see a pharmacy robot and it's going down, it's probably going back to the pharmacy, right? It's probably
so if you work in the pharmacy, you might hitch a lift.
Or you're on or you work on that floor that the pharmacy's on. You'll get on and it won't stop anywhere else, because that's another thing that we do with the controller. We get an express ride, so we call it, it comes to us empty, and we ride directly to our floor.
Nice.
And so people, if they catch on and they're
Why
clever.
Why take the 6 when you could take the 4?
And frankly, from the robot's perspective, it doesn't matter as long as they're happy just going to that floor and not going to complain about not being able to get off on another floor.
Yeah.
So, but that's what we do. It works really well. And again, it allows the hospital to make the best use of what is a pretty expensive infrastructure item, right? An elevator. You don't want to have to put in an elevator just for a robot. So when we're not using it, it's available to everybody to use.
Yeah.
So people can use it, and then from there, the hospital will decide, is it only for staff? Is it for visitors, doctors, guests, whatever? That's up to them. But when we use it, we essentially say, okay, we're going to use it right now for this one ride that'll take 15 seconds, and then we'll let everybody else use it again.
Nice.
So, and then that's a trade-off, and we have simulation tools that we work with our customers to try to make sure they understand in advance that, okay, if you just want to give us 2 elevators and it's going to work this way, here's how the meals are going to look, meaning this is how long that meal service will take. And then we can go through a bunch of what ifs, right? Well, what if you dedicate the elevators? What if you give us a 3rd elevator? What if, and then they can make the right decisions for them.
Nice. Yeah, that's awesome. Just eyes open.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's been a great tool for us that we've developed, over the years and are continuing to refine. Especially, we work with some of our customers very early before they've even, dug a hole in the ground to make the hospital. So we have some ability to influence some of the decisions about exactly how the building will operate when it's done, and we do a lot of that through simulation early on.
Yeah, that's actually really smart. When was it that you started using simulations to? I mean, I guess it was probably around the same time you got involved in the architecture of the hospitals.
Yeah, it was a while back. I'm going to say at least 10 years ago. So we were early into it. We actually teamed up with a professor from, I think it was Arizona State. I'm not sure if it was University of Arizona, Arizona State right now. And he was doing some work in the area and in the area of queuing and wait times, and we thought it was a good mix. So this was I'll call it old-fashioned simulation, meaning it wasn't what I think of simulation today. It was nothing you could look at on a screen and watch the robots going. It was purely algorithmic spread. Like you put in some information, you hit a button, and it came back with the answers and some graphs, and you're like, okay, that's not going to work. We need to adjust some things. But we found that it was really accurate. But honestly, the reason we did the simulation early on was as we made the pivot into new construction that I talked about before, we started getting into bigger and bigger systems. And one of the interesting phenomenon that we saw was on the buying side. They don't know how many robots they need. They've never even thought about a robot before. Remember, people just don't wake up thinking they want robots.
Of course.
So they have no idea. And there's nothing to judge by because this is still a very early adopter market. You can't go visit the hospital down the street and say, oh, they're 300 beds, we're 300 beds, they have 10 robots, we'll get 10 robots. There's just really no comparisons. And even when you look at two hospitals that have similar sizes, even if they run similar models, so I was telling you earlier that you got to look at the model and the size, but even if you had similar size and a similar model, the architecture could be different, right? You could have a hospital, a 300-bed hospital that's 3 stories and a 300-bed hospital that's 6 stories, right? Just built different, ones in the city, maybe ones in the suburbs, and those differences could change, right? So you can't just go look at your neighbor and go, oh, I know how many robots I need. So anyway, we found it was, as we were getting into these bigger projects, the dollars were going up in the contract value, and we're going from a couple $100,000 to millions of dollars, right? And people were getting a little bit more conservative and going, and I'm wondering if that's the right number of robots. And so our job was getting harder and harder. And so we said, all right, let's do simulation. And we did it for 2 reasons. One was, let's do it to see if we can convince customers that these numbers are right, so we can take some of the doubt away and help with the contracting process.
Makes a lot of sense.
And that it was definitely helpful, but we still were the ones who invented the simulator, right? So it's still our answer, right? So the other thing that we did, and this was early on, we said, you know what, we need a better way to convince customers this is the right number of robots. And so we said we need to put something in the contract so we can take some of the risk away from them. So we started to look at putting in a clause in our contract that said this is the right number of robots for this amount of work. So we would document through the simulation. Actually helped us do this. You're going to make 600 trash cart moves and 500 linen cart moves, and you're going to go from these areas, right? So they'd all be defined, and we had them in an architectural drawing, and that's what was loaded in the simulator. So we could take that input that went into the simulator, put it as an appendix in the contract, and say, if this is your workflow, this is the right number of robots.
What do you think is next for Aethon and for you?
Well, like I said, I think we're really proud of what we've done. Whether everybody else acknowledges it or not, I think
it's awesome.
I think they do. We realize there's a lot of other cool things out there, and we can't get all the attention all the time. But I think the reality is the hospital market. I mean, you asked us our market share. We have again, according to Perplexity, we have a dominant market share, but we have a dominant market share of a market that's penetrated like 3%. And so what we focus on.
So that means there's only robots in 3% of hospitals.
Yeah, or at least logistics robots. Yeah. It's very, very small. And we've built a business that survives on that by picking the right projects.
But that's awesome, because that means you've got so much untapped market to get into.
Yeah. So that's you asked about the future. That's what we focus on. We're convinced every hospital should have them, right? I remember somebody who was on our board once. I won't say who because maybe he won't want me to attribute this to him, although he probably should. He said he was with another company that was very, very successful in hospital technology. And he used to always say to me, Peter, even when we had this product, which I won't name it just because I'm not sure if they want it to be named. But
fair enough.
But if I named it, it's in every hospital now. I mean, every single hospital. He said when we were first selling this thing, we would walk out and we'd get thrown out the door. People said, we're never going to use this. And he used to just turn to his colleague and say, we might have just met the last person who will ever buy this technology. and he said, that's just the way you have to think of it. There's other people, right? And so you just got to keep moving on. And that person may just be the last person to get it. And so that's kind of our attitude is that, there's a lot of people that aren't ready for it yet or don't see it yet or worried about the wrong things, or at least from our perspective, they're worried about the wrong things. But our mission is about lowering all the obstacles, right? So we're constantly trying to remove all the barriers and obstacles to get to the other 97%, right?
Yeah.
And some of that is cost-based, some of it is the infrastructure that's needed, some of it is the ability to operate multiple robots in the same environment. There's a plethora of reasons that
some of it's probably just like a perception of, is this a mature technology?
Sure.
Once they're in 50%, I'm sure that the other 50 are going to be clamoring.
Absolutely. It's it will, we've seen the results that in the hospitals that we're in, they're fantastic. The other folks will catch on at some point. So again, we see it as our mission to figure out what we can do better to help them adopt the technology quicker. And it's in some ways it's a tough market in the sense that I think hospitals invest in a lot of technology, but most of it's clinical. And a lot of that is expensive, and they don't always have a lot of money left over, right? So
right. It doesn't necessarily help their outcomes with patient satisfaction as much as faster meals would.
That's right. So, we're on this mission to convince them. And so, we definitely go through waves, with the economy being one way or the other, where we see more interest and less interest. The availability of labor is definitely a driver, in our business. But what we find is that the types of things that our robots do are the things that people don't want to do.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
And so, I can remember from the early days, that was the big concern we had is, are we going to be displacing jobs? And again, kind of as I said earlier, we want to put robots to work. At some level, that is what's happening. Sometimes it's hard for all of us to acknowledge that because we feel bad or we don't want that to be the public message. But in the end, there's a lot of jobs that people don't want to do. And particularly in hospitals, there's a lot of jobs that people can do that robots can't do. And that's what we promote. That's what they should be doing, and they should be focusing on those things. But so for Aethon, our thing is we've got such a huge amount of market share ahead of us. We've dominated in this market, at least according to Perplexity. So,
that you keep crediting Perplexity with that.
Yeah, I don't want people to think I made that up myself, right? So we're just committed to figuring out how do we get the other 97%. And we know it's there, and that it's our job to bring it home.
That's awesome.
So
cool. Well, hey, I think that's probably like a wonderful note to end on.
Well, great.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for having me. I enjoyed it a lot.
Peter, thanks for coming on.
Hey, anytime, Spencer.
Cool. Is there anything you want to plug as we kind of near the end?
No, just that people should listen to your podcast. It's awesome. I've listened to a couple episodes. I've always enjoyed them.
Thanks, buddy. And if you're building a hospital and you need robots, look no further than Aethon.
There you go. Look us up. We'll be glad to come out and talk to you.
Awesome. Well, hey, thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Spencer.
Thanks for joining us today. If you've made it this far, chances are you'll like other episodes too. Collaborative with Spencer Krause can be found on YouTube, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Pocket Casts, and Radio Public. Subscribe today to get notified when the latest episodes release and support the channel. Collaborative with Spencer Krause is sponsored by SKA Robotics. If you're in the market for elite field robotics expertise, please consider hiring SKA Robotics. They sponsor this podcast and solve some of the toughest engineering problems in the world. SKA Robotics can be found at skarobotics.com.